I'd be irritated. I hope you had a good night. Thank you. It was fun to see. I didn't realize that a lot of you were staying at the same hotel. I felt safer. Thanks. But I won't let you watch my kids yet. Well, it's good to see you. So we're going to, as I said today, I think what I want to do today is make sure that we focus on the practicalities of how do we build and deliver this disruptive intervention approach that's foundations are in biological science, neuroscience, and genomics, rather than in what we call in casework as usual, I've called for years the service traditions of our system, right? The truth is that what I'm going to challenge you to do is you're going to have to learn, you have to be able to do both, because the reality is that you continue to exist in a legacy system that is not simply run by you. You've got judges who are either very skilled at this legacy system or are learning it and believe it's important. And you have lawyers who play various roles who work in this legacy system, and you have state partners and CASA volunteers, etc. The reality is that we, for a bit, we have to sort of, as you'll get into today, hold two truths: that there is and continues to be a legacy system, and it has limitations, and there is strong bedrock evidence about an alternative approach which builds capability both in terms of supporting development and health, and building intentional communities around young people and families, and them being at the center of building and living a good life. Those both things right now, the ultimate first step with us working together would be that you would get to a place where you would have both. In an ideal environment, we would sunset the legacy system and we would stand up the other. But that's not where we're at right now, and I want to be upfront about that. Couple of random thoughts from overnight, and then we're going to start the day in a minute by looking at a film. I always feel very fortunate when we have someone like Kim who is kind enough to and courageous enough to share the story of Kenny.
I'll talk about my kids all day.
Good. It's a gift, although I have to admit it's the kind of gift that will keep me up all night and preoccupy me for days. And I have a hard time letting go of these kids. There's a story I tell for years now, but I was just telling these folks. In 2005, I got asked to come to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, to lead a process to close an orphanage there that you wouldn't have never heard of. You probably wouldn't have guessed that there was an orphanage right in Hollywood. But you would know its most famous resident. She became known as Marilyn Monroe later in her life. And her estate had been and continues to support this group called Holly Grove. And they specialized in so-called residential care for 6 to 12-year-old kids. And they were licensed, as some of you know, we license things in the system. And they had a license up to the age of 12, which means that on your 13th birthday, you need to leave. And I would say, in my experience with orphanages in the world, it was probably the most well-run orphanage I've ever seen. They had an extraordinary level of support from the Hollywood community. Their board was the who's who of the Hollywood, community. The chairman of Sony Pictures, the chairperson of Comcast, the creator of MTV and BTV, and even at the time, if you'll remember years ago, something called the Rugrats. The creator of the Rugrats was on the board, and they kept the place running. Judy, who ran the place, told me a story. They were literally across the street from Sony Pictures in the back of their property, and if she decided or her team decided that they wanted to give these kids a special experience, they had the kind of relationship with Sony Pictures that they could let them know we'd like to have a medieval knights and damsels day event on a Saturday here. And they would plan it with them, and what would happen is the kids would go to bed on maybe a Friday night, and then overnight, very quietly, the Sony Pictures people would come in, and they would make it look like a Hollywood set by the next morning, and they would have the A and B talent from the industry on the property, and kids would get to makeup, and in the morning, and they'd be transformed into these outfits, and they would, ride horses, and it would be an extraordinary thing. And it was really, I'm not sure that I know of another orphanage in the world where they do that. But on your 13th birthday, the county car would come get you, and you'd be taken back to the office at one of the offices in LA, and you would sit in your social worker's cube until they found some foster home in a bad neighborhood to move you to. And the director of child welfare for LA County didn't think that that was really ethical or right. And he is one of the senior leaders at Casey Family Programs today. And anyway, so he asked me to come down, and I to do permanency work for the county, which they still do. I'm back. And within 60 days, there were 46 kids left in the program at the time, and 60 days later, 42 of them were home with a family that was said not to exist. And the remaining 4 were, unfortunately, got that ride in the car and got placed somewhere. And the result of that is that the board at the group home, or I guess it's a group home, I call it an orphanage. The board, we had a final meeting with them, and they had questions. How is it possible that we've spent decades pouring money into this place because you convinced us that these are kids who have no one? And this man comes, and 60 days later, 42 of them are home. Somebody, I don't know who, but somebody had a friendship with the chairman at the time of CBS Television and CBS News, and pretty soon I started getting haunted by Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes. And finally, a year later, decided that I had no choice but to do it because she wouldn't leave me alone. And the story of family finding was really the story that I want to remind you about, which was never intended to be a story about how you empty the foster care system in America. It was really a story about a system that I told you yesterday taught me the first lesson within 2 weeks, which is this kid's got nobody. And the truth is that it was almost never true. The kids had nobody, including Kenny. That really wasn't what happened. Clearly, I can't see it any other way but to say that when we hear or say ourselves, this kid has nobody, I don't think we're saying that we believe literally they have nobody in most cases. I think what we're really saying or have said is they have nobody that counts for much. We've got a tradition that has a 400-year-old history of moving children from so-called bad people to good people. And who decides who the good people are? You do. And so what we're going to work on today is not family finding all these years later. What we're going to really work on today is a different approach, which some have called family seeing rather than family finding. Because what happened with the work that I did when it was seen through the lens of permanency planning by a system that believed in permanency planning is what they did with family finding is they saw it as an opportunity to look for ready-made families or prove that they don't exist, right? So you could, hire these family finders, and they'll go out and find these people, and then somebody with authority is going to make a decision about whether they're really good people or not. And if they're not good enough, or if we've got someone we like better, and then we would disappear them, right? And you see it in the story of Kenny. You see, if you really think about that, I'm standing on the side. Remember, this is the casework as usual side. There, you guys could probably help me this morning tell the story that we have as an industry that justifies what is happening to him, and in this case, to you. There is a story. I suspect there is a story that he needs and deserves and must have certain kinds of therapy, that he needs to be in a secure facility where he can have his needs met. Does that sound familiar? And if his needs can't be met there, then we just simply, your challenge is to find a place that will meet his needs. I don't know that you, like some states, are struggling with out-of-state placements, but in the worst form of that, we tend to think that the places that are the farthest away from us are the places that are most healing for our most complex needs kids. And for example, one of the states I work in have a habit of driving kids all the way down to Central Florida to magical places that take kids there and writing them big checks. And there's a whole history of doing that. And there are judges that might believe, because they've been taught this, believe that to do less than to order that young person into that institution is to fail in their responsibilities to protect that child's rights. There may be guardian ad litems, or there may be CASA volunteers who have been taught and convinced that that brochure they got from that special place that focuses on attachment disorders is the thing this kid needs, and they're willing to fight anybody to get it done. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. All of that thinking is based on a big shift that happened in this industry in the last, I'd say, 40 years. And that I tend to look back to the mid-1980s or the 80s as a time when this really particularly happened in the public sense. A lot of you are probably not old enough to remember this, but for a time there was a guy by the name of, what was his name? Well, you'll know what he invented because it's practically a bumper sticker for most people. It's called the dysfunctional family. And he got really famous for this whole theory of thinking that what was wrong, what led most Americans to feel this discomfort in their lives and their difficulty in relationships was the fact that they were the product of dysfunctional families. And that what they ought to do is admit that, and what they ought to try to do is go find a therapist who sees the world that way also, and really build their own lives and write off or walk away from that dysfunctional family that had harmed them. Brad, I can't remember this guy, he died a few years ago, Brad something. I'm speaking of his last name. Anyway, I shouldn't speak ill of the dead anyway. But he got so famous that they used him. You guys have public television here, and you know how they do these fundraisers, and they'll play these health-related, endless things that are usually recorded sets that you can buy if you donate money to them. He was that for them. He filled stadiums with Americans telling them about the reason you're so unhappy is your parents suck. And that's why if you want, you're welcome. Don't forget to leave a donation at the door. And if your parents will refuse to get over their sucking, then just get them out of your life. But that whole idea of dysfunctional families really, was happening. Another thing that happened that was racialized in the same, sometime in the early mid-'80s was children without a conscience. Now that was aimed particularly at black kids, and it explained why they were so dangerous and why they were beyond help and needed to be locked up. And even Hillary Clinton was a big advocate and spoke during the Clinton administration about these kids without a conscience that were really, again, targeted at poor and black kids and really became the precursor for the mass incarceration movement that ended up and continues to happen. So there were different groups. If you were white and privileged, your problem were your parents. And if you were black and poor, your problem is you don't have a conscience and you're a super predator. But all of that thinking that was going on ended up, sort of getting us as a country to begin to look at what we were worried about with young kids and with dysfunctional parents, and increasingly look to the mental health community as a solution for them. We began to look at, probably at the time, probably would have been the DSM-3, looking to these diagnostic categories and these particular labels and the behavioral checklists that help clinicians pick which condition you had, and then begin to put you into some kind of therapeutic experience. And in the worst case, put you into therapeutic environments, institutional placements. For the more dangerous kids, we like to put them on wagon trains in Arizona or Montana, or put them on a sheep ranch in Wyoming, or any place but here. But I think that really settled in. And what I'm going to do today is, using Kenny just for a minute, give you we could tell the story of this kid. Again, I'm guessing, you'll remind me, but guessing oppositional, or what are they calling? Are they calling him conduct disordered?
Several.
What are they, just for fun?
ODD, conduct disorder, PTSD, ADHD.
Yeah, so the usual suspects. So they didn't throw a bipolar disorder in there on him yet? Yeah, it must be running out of popularity. But otherwise, he's got he's got the four horsemen for these kids. The ODD, ADD. We love to throw in the trauma thing now because we are sensitive to trauma, and that whole way of thinking. Then he's got a set of behaviors, right, that we all recognize and are real and are challenging for adults, I'm sure. And all of this package ends up justifying what we do with kids with that kind of a story, right? And we went through that yesterday. We looked at the data in this kid's background. I'm just going to go back through and show you this. Kenny's a 14-year-old black young man. He, in his 14 years on the planet, has spent 8 years involved in government systems. During those 8 years, he's had or maybe his 14 years, he's had at least 7 changes in primary attachment figure. He's disrupted in unplanned ways 2 to 3 school placements. He is behind academically. He is struggling academically and probably not on track to graduate from high school, although we hope that's not true, but that's the worry. His current placement is a locked setting, and he may be there about 2 more months before you're under pressure to get him to the next place of healing, if that's what we want to call it. He has all 5 childhood adversity experiences. And what do you think his early life was like, up to, say, the age of 3? What do you think life was like, if you could guess? So he experienced significant neglect. Did he witness violence as a little baby boy, little kid, do you think?
I know that they have a history with watching domestic abuse,
Yeah.
as well as drug abuse.
Yep. Yeah. And were they poor? Yeah. And what was going on with their housing? Do you know at all? Were they stably housed? Were they moving around? Or?
I think for the most part they were stably housed.
Okay.
I don't remember anything of them being homeless at one point.
And how long was his life like this with his family before he came into care? Was it pretty consistently that way? So when he was 6 was the first time he was removed. So what I'm listening for there is I'm trying to get an idea, particularly what was going on around him from maybe the time of conception until he's about 36 months old, particularly up until actually about 24 months. I was reminding myself this morning, so I didn't I woke up at 3 o'clock, so it gave me lots of times to prepare to talk to you guys. And so I was reviewing the Bucharest study. The Bucharest study is now 21 years old, and it is a study of a cohort of children who were living in orphanages in Romania. These are children up to the age of 3 from 21 years ago who were in orphanages in Bucharest, and there was no foster care in the country at that time. There was, it's been said that, I'm sure it's an overstatement, but an orphanage on every corner. There were 170, I think all told, during the Ceausescu regime, I think they got up to something like 170,000 children in orphanages during his time before he was put out of office and killed. And they took a cohort of these kids in Bucharest and they sorted them. They could do it ethically because there was no alternative to orphanages. You either were home or you were in an orphanage. And so the researchers from the United States funded and created a high-quality treatment foster care model in Bucharest and recruited foster parents, paid them really well, trained them really well, supported them well, and they put a comparison group of the kids. They made sure they didn't have any developmental disabilities or underlying conditions. They looked to be normatively developing. They were under the age of 2.5. And they moved a cohort of them into this specialized foster care, and then they left the other kids in the orphanage. And then they, keep in mind, remember, they could only help 150 kids, so, it's not like they left them there. There's nowhere else to go. And the other thing they did is they recruited a group of children from poor Romanian families who never went to the orphanage and stayed in their first families. And what they've been doing is following all 3 groups of kids now for 21 years. And what they saw is if you got a kid out of the orphanage by the 20th month to the 24th month of life and put them into high-quality foster care, when IQ scores were one measure, the IQ scores for the kids who were left in the orphanage were right around 40 to 60. And there was a bounce back in terms of development for the babies who went into foster care, and their IQs went up to about 90. And then the kids who were left with poor Romanian families, their full-scale IQs on average were about 100. So, and what ends up happening over 21 years, using that example, is you see that that's exactly what it looks like 21 years later, that difference. The kids who were left to grow up and are now adults in the orphanages developed severe disabilities and dysfunction and are not able to live safely in the community. They came up with a term called pseudo-autism to describe the impact on their neurobiology. The kids who went into the foster care arrangements, persisted in that improvement, right? They bounced up, again, around 90. There are other measures too, but I'm using IQ as one. And then the kids who stayed in their first families continued on an upward trajectory and looked pretty normative in their development compared to other people. What's interesting about the Bucharest studies is really consistent with the data from England that I talked to you about, which is all reverse of our tradition. Our tradition is to value, based on needs, we value a higher and higher level of so-called care for people who have greater and greater needs, with the rationale that that care is going to produce a result that's valued, right? It's worth paying for. That makes sense, what I'm saying. That's our service tradition. But the data from England and the data from Bucharest, and there's data from Stockholm, Sweden as well, that also similar, shows that when you actually look at life course outcomes, when it can be done safely, as far as we know, the best outcomes are kids who stay with parents even if those parents are poor and struggling. They're considerably better. The kids who go to foster or kinship care relative to the kids who go to foster and institutional care do better, but not as good as the kids who stay with their parents. and the kids who go to foster and institutional care and stay there do the worst of all. The data patterns in repeated studies are over and over again. So the data in terms of life course outcomes for people that get these services don't support the working theory of change that we have come to, which is to use the DSM-5 and these discrete diagnostic categories and then match people to a level of care for these so-called conditions. And of course, as you know, for 25 years, the idea about fixing that problem was to make sure that the therapies that people get are so-called EBPs, or evidence-based practices, right? That's our working kind of model. I want to offer a very challenging, different one that's been emerging. The first would be on the top, this will be sacrilege. How many of you are trained as therapists, by the way? So remember, I might say things that are wounding, so just take a breath. Because you are probably still paying those school loans, and now you're really going to want a refund. But the science that came out of, most recently came out of Europe was, there was science undertaken by one of the major universities in Europe, or more than one. Quite frankly, I know there's one. And the question was, what is the empirical evidence for the DSM-5? For the diagnostic categories within the DSM-5 document, what is the empirical evidence for these things? Here was the answer: none whatsoever. None. The commentary from the researchers, what is the DSM? It was an attempt by the psychological community who was worried about beginning to look less and less relevant compared to physical medicine, and they needed to demonstrate that there was something empirically, something that would encourage people to be confident in psychology, and they needed it to look scientific. And so they created the original DSM and then subsequent DSMs based to really make it look as though there was a scientific basis for what they were doing. And of course, what happened along the way was it became deeply tied to how we pull money out of Medicaid, and also, quite frankly, how we even qualify people for 4E, 4B, because we have to demonstrate a severe condition in order to qualify people to pull down the federal entitlement programs. So what happens is they very skillfully get the DSM process and that whole way of thinking embedded in the way that the money flows from these entitlement programs. And but the evidence from the research was there was no empirical evidence at all. There's a reaction going on certainly in Europe to that, and I know you'll be shocked, but there are crickets in America about that conversation. I don't know how many people got the memo that the DSM-5 had no empirical evidence. I suspect you didn't get one. There's been more of a conversation in the European, especially Western Europe, about this. Let me tell you what the reaction of clinicians in Europe has been so far was what they recommended, which is I found very interesting, was to clinicians that instead of looking at the DSM-5 as a way to make a diagnosis, that you should return to an earlier methodology called a formulation exercise, which would have been 35. Remember, we did one yesterday on Kenny. And the whole point being that we needed what they thought was that the former approach, the formulation approach, relied on more data points to come to a conclusion about someone's needs. So rather than a discrete list of 10 behaviors, and if you got 7 of them, you win the lottery, they thought that maybe it was better in terms of former practice to look at a much larger number of data points in order to come to a conclusion about what might be happening for somebody and then direct their care. So that's right now the recommendation at least with some of that community is to go back and use this formulation approach to come to diagnostic conclusions while we continue to look at the validity needs around the present day system. But I really like a different approach, which is from a person who has a funny title. He's called the Special Rapporteur for Mental Health, and he works for the United Nations. And I don't know if you know this, but there are a variety of, what I've always thought were cool jobs is you get to be the special rapporteur, which is a cool title. I mean, there's senior practitioner and then there's special rapporteur. And the special rapporteur for mental health works around the world with UN members and confronting the issues of mental health care. And he particularly has a habit of releasing a new statement each October. I think it's October 10th is World Mental Health Day. And last October 10th, I was in Belgium doing a talk on the 10th. And I wanted to acknowledge Mental Health Day, and so I read the statement from the Special Rapporteur. And I just was thinking overnight about Kenny, and I wanted to kind of use this and see if it made any sense, and then we'll get on with this. You know, in terms of, remember what I said yesterday, to me, the first question after safety and a commitment to building a network, the first question we've got to confront is, what is the intervention anyway, right? Now, there is an intervention from Kenny. It comes through the casework as usual approach. The intervention is oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit disorder. What was the other one he had?
PTSD?
Post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was ODD and then conduct disorder. That's my favorite one, conduct disorder. Makes me want to pull what hair I have remaining out of my head. But we've got a theory of change, and we're delivering an intervention for this kid, and its foundation is in the DSM-5 at this point, and that's how we're pulling down Medicaid, and that's how we're qualifying, making sure he's eligible. There may be some other questions too about 4E, 4B. And the provider who's got him, of course, is doing God's work, and they're going to heal all these kids, or at least try to hold on to them. And by the way, tell me what Kenny's life, now you've all thought about him tonight, hopefully overnight, at least for a minute. Somebody tell me what Kenny's life is like at age 60, on the trajectory he's on right now.
Trash.
What? What's that mean?
It's not going to be looking very good. More than likely, the issues that he has now are still going to be prevailing whenever he's 60.
Can I shape that a little bit? What do we mean by health trajectory? And do you remember the fulcrum and the lever? The fulcrum is the genes he inherited and the epigenome, and the epigenome being highly responsive to experience, and the idea of gene environment interaction, right? So in fact, he won't have the mental health problems that he has now, because they will have grown in which direction? They will have grown far worse by the time he's 60, won't they? Okay? And how's he going to cope with what that feels like in his body? Imagine what that feels like. What do you think he's getting the crap beat out of him once in a while, and if not actually happening, he's worried it's going to happen, so he's constantly, as Bruce Perry would say, tuned up, right? That toxic stress exposure. And so what do we know about stress response systems? We know that if you expose people long enough in their development to terror, they end up with a stress response system set permanently on high, right? Do you think that might have happened to him by now? Yes. So what's it like to live in that body, do you think? What do you think it feels like?
I think it feels terrible, and more than likely he'll have more severe health issues.
Right, and so what's he going to do to cope with it? Terrible includes, by the way, pain. Pain is associated with this. It's not just a psychological experience, it's a embodied experience, and it does lead to disease. So how is he going to cope with the pain? Is he a prescriber? Can he go and write himself a script? And somehow is a great point. I don't know that although he does have a family history and saw, people struggling with addiction, but his addiction could be really powerful painkillers. It could be alcohol. It could be a stimulant. It could be high carbohydrate foods. It could be really sugary drinks. It could be promiscuous sexuality. It could be punching someone in the face. We know he's got a 20% greater risk of becoming a prisoner because he's male and because he witnessed domestic violence as a little boy. And he lived in poverty. We know composition matters in terms of predicting outcomes. If you're male and you're little and you witness family violence and you grow up in poverty, what we know about that composition is that there's a 20% likelihood of becoming a career criminal, becoming prison. That doesn't mean he will, it's just a probability, right? This isn't about guaranteeing anything for Kenny, but what we know is that his probabilities for these various outcomes are changed because his experiences changed his body. So Vince Folletti, again, one of the authors of the ACEs research, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, said famously, drug addiction is a public health crisis. Would you agree with him?
Yes.
For the community, it is a solution for Kenny, which points at something. We have a history. What are the words we use in our private and public lives to talk about people who are addicted? What names do we use for them? Junkie. What else? Crackhead. What is it? Addict. Drunk. We have lovely language for them, don't we? What's the general advice that people seem to have come to when they've got an addict in their lives? What generally do people do when they've got someone in their life who they would say refuses to stop abusing drugs? Cut them out, right? And we have a place when we cut them out for them to go, don't we? Prison, inpatient treatment, 12-step groups. You get the picture. But what this science suggests is, and Gabor Mate, who's a famous one, I think he wrote a book. If you're interested in addiction, I think it's probably the best book I've ever seen. It's called In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost. And Gabor, Gabor, Mate, M-A-T-E, he's a Canadian from British Columbia. He's a doctor. And you probably have heard this, you just probably didn't know that Gabor is the one who said it. Gabor would say, not why the drugs, but why the pain. What does he mean in the realm of the hungry ghost? What is the hungry ghost? He treated primarily opiate addiction in his career. So we're talking about heroin and fentanyl and carfentanil. What do you think he meant by the hungry ghost? What's the hungry ghost, do you think? It's what happened to you as a kid. And here's the saying, not every person who becomes addicted, how does he say it? Because I'm about to mess this up. Basically what he's saying is almost all addiction is tied to early childhood experience and the alterations in the super system of the body. And that gets back to Folletti's point. What is a crisis for the public is a solution for the individual. So are we really treating addiction when we treat abstinence? Well, it's not good evidence that that's working. The best evidence we've got is you have to go into the dog's mouth and you have to treat what happened in the family with people, right? So the Special Rapporteur for Mental Health said this on World Mental Health Day last October 10th. He said that I'm paraphrasing, he said it much more elegantly, but basically he said that world governments, when it comes to mental health care for their citizens, had bought into a story by the industry of chemical imbalances. Has anybody ever heard this, that depression and anxiety are chemical imbalances, right? We've been sold that. And he said two things. He said that it would be better for the world governments to understand that it is, and take responsibility for the fact that it is not a chemical imbalance, it is a power imbalance. And that we've medicalized, listen to the language and think about Kenny. Think about Kenny. We have medicalized unlivable lives. Does Kenny really have oppositional defiant disorder, if that's really anything? Or is Kenny really experiencing an unlivable life? What do you think? So which are we going to treat? Do you see, the dominant culture system as we have it has decided that it's easier and more profitable to treat Kenny's oppositional defiant disorder and PTSD with a combination of drugs, so-called therapies, and institutional settings, which will lead him to be, at best, suffering with at least 3 chronic, incurable, chronic diseases by the time he's 60. And I'm talking just about his physical condition, not his mental health condition, right? That will be the result of that. We can predict that today. By the way, what will the government have spent between the federal government and the state of Missouri? What will we have spent all in for this kid by the time he's 21?
I'd say millions, because we're already paying $1,000.
Yeah. I have a tough question that I think we ought to be held account to answer in every case at the end when he leaves, and that is simply who benefited. What evidence will there be that this kid benefits? Now, in a very strict child protection world of safety, what we'll say is he didn't die on our watch. Are we treating that list of 4 conditions, or are we really treating an unlivable life? Because the intervention is different. If we were treating Kenny for the diagnosis of an unlivable life, if that were our diagnosis, how would we do it? How would you do it? What would be the first thing you would do with Kenny if you decided that it was important to treat his unlivable life? Now, here's the added problem for Kenny. He has the misfortune of being a child while he's living his unlivable life. So there's something happening to him that doesn't happen to adults, and that is he's developing his brain and body every day. You remember the old Got Milk campaign? Remember the stickers? You ought to get one that says development is happening, put it on your car, and don't forget it. Every day. For better or for worse, isn't it? And so the problem isn't just that he's living an unlivable life. It's a problem that you and I are living an unlivable life. But for him, it's a more complex problem, because that unlivable life is shaping his trajectory in terms of his lifelong health, his brain architecture, the way his hormones work in his body, and it's been going on for 14 years. So there's no right answer. I'm not setting you up for, to me, to look like some kind of smart guy. We have to make it up. If we're going to work differently, if you are actually going to produce the opportunity for kids like Kenny and his family to actually find justice and have the ability to live a good life, we're going to have to learn how to treat the diagnosis of an unlivable life. The fact is, he's not living an unlivable life alone. He was born into one. The generationality of this, right? I don't know your state, and it's not, I'm not going to comment specifically on your state's context. The closest I've gotten in your state to what I'm going to talk about was watching what unfolded in Ferguson a few years ago. But he happens to also be African American, and he happens to be in this state, and I have to wonder that part of the unlivable life experience for him, we can't ignore the reality of his context, the reality of what he faces. Will he be seen, we call it the y-axis. Will he, as a 17-year-old, as he grows worse in his health and his behavior in all likelihood, or a 19-year-old young black man, will he, when he encounters difficulty with his behavior in the community, will he be seen as someone who would benefit from mental health treatment and be headed off in that direction? Or will he be seen as dangerous in the community and be headed off towards the prison system? What do you think? You know exactly what's going to happen to him, right? It isn't hypothetical. But I'll remind you of something. What is predictable is preventable. But we have to answer the question, what is the intervention anyway? Your system's decided the intervention is to keep him alive until we're no longer responsible for him. That's what your state has done, just as the other states have done. And you can lay the responsibility for that also at the feet of Congress, right? My question to you yesterday, both organizationally and individually, is not how to do the work, but who will I be in my work? What I would challenge you to think about doing as an organization is learn to know the difference between repeating service traditions that have labeled us as a broken system for our entire careers and before us, and an unlivable life. But I want to come back to the practical question. What would be the first step towards treating his unlivable life? What would be the first thing you would do? Move him where?
Somewhere where he's not in danger every day, so he can maybe lower his toxic stress a little.
I'm
I don't have the answer of where. None of us.
well,
I'll put him in the house with his grandparents. Wait. Yeah. Or in the house with the family friend that was willing to not only adopt him, but his two siblings as well.
okay. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Now, but I started the morning by saying and acknowledging, just because I can talk you into this craziness doesn't mean the judge is going to buy it or the guardian ad litem's going to buy it. So what's the first step?
Bring him to the table.
You have to, don't you? Because you don't get to decide. Apparently, you're supposed to be the case managers for these kids, aren't you? And yet, do you really get to decide? But we'd be happy to hold you responsible for it. But the truth is that it's not an individual decision, that part of what's going on here is the result of a wide fractures between competing systems with different responsibilities. You have the case management responsibility for the child's day-to-day existence, but there's a judge that has responsibility for his rights, and there is a therapist responsible for his treatment, and there's a guardian ad litem who apparently speaks for the child. We've broken it into all these bits, and everyone has a different view about what's going on with him. So I think the point is you know where you want to go with this, but in fairness, we're going to have to learn to get really skilled at how we have this conversation with our partners. And one of those things is just working with families. It's not what matters is their ability to make decisions, their ability to gain insight, not that you can make their decisions for them, right? So I think the point is that what we try to do and did with the formulation exercise, and the other way we'll look at later today, which is we'll practice the mindful positioning work, these are methodologies to get our allied partners to blend, what we call blend perspective with us, and come to a consensus view of what is the intervention anyway. Because if you had the support of the judge, if you had the support of the guardian ad litem, if you had the support and you had a consensus view of what the intervention that would heal this boy's life would be, you would be well supported in doing that intervention, wouldn't you? Yeah. Go ahead, please.
I think we're seeing a lean toward that type of intervention.
Mm-hmm.
But what I also see lacking is how do we repair that damage that's already done? Because I can get them back home with family.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so much damage already done that the family can't heal them on their own. And so when the family has to bring them back in care, you've got those judges and that system looking at you and saying, see,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
we've got to think beyond, okay, we know that that's the first step and it's the right step to take, so I'm not at all. But we also got to make sure we've got to find out a way to make that step successful to heal the damage already done, or we're not going to be able to keep them
Absolutely. Look, what we've talked about up to this point is a high-level discussion about how to get an alignment within the system to simply get him out of a place where people are beating him up. To your point, it has nothing to do with how he's going to live safely in that family and in the community after all he and they have been through, isn't it? So that gets exactly to the point. You set the stage really well for today. What we've got to talk about is how do you build up, how do you construct healing in a family and with this young person? And the first hint I would suggest is almost always in family find. I've got these family finders up, you, and who else? You? Are there any other ones in the room? She stepped away. What do I want to say about that? How do I want to say it? I lost my thought because I've got three things going in my head at one time. We've got to work. I wanted to ask you if you would agree with me about this or not. But here's my view, and I've said this many times. Almost always in family finding, it's a time machine. We were called in because we had a little boy getting beat up at an institution after 8 years in the system. But the truth is, what really happened in that family was never about this little boy, was always about what happened to his parents, and was always about what happened to his grandparents. How true do you think that is? So when I say, what is the intervention anyway, who is the intervention really with? It's with his parents, and it's with his grandparents, and it's within their neighborhood and their church. It's something happened there. And sometimes it was a particular thing, and sometimes it was a series of things, but it happened, and it created fractures in that family, and over time, those fractures have just grown wider and wider and wider. And this little boy becomes not only a reflection of that experience, but then he had his own experience in our system, didn't he? And that's the truth of what we're really up against. And it, quite frankly, is the only work that really matters. What's interesting is how quick we are willing as a country to decide there is no hope for a family because it would all be too much. And then that same day, I quite frankly hate to racialize this, but I will, because I'm feeling it, is some white guy who's 60 years old is going to be diagnosed with stage 3 prostate cancer, and he and the insurance company are going to pour $2 million into his treatment without even blinking. And he may or may not make it. But these people are too much. We could never make that commitment. Quite frankly, that's what I think is happening here, and we really need to confront that. By the way, we don't need to spend. We could have healed this family and that little boy for far less than the millions you will spend on him to ruin his life. Do you think that's true? Yes. And quite frankly, like the Wisconsin families, possibly if we just freaking given them the money to begin with. We'll spend, for these high-cost kids, we will spend more annually than it cost for tuition and housing at Harvard. This kid could be at Harvard right now for what we're spending. That's been shown over and over again. But healing is what we've got to do. Now, here's the thing is, we've got to define what is healing, what are the parameters, what are the limits? And it depends on where you stand. What if, again, first of all, we have traditions around healing specific health conditions and mental health conditions that are very formalized, require people with particular credentials to do that. And you're all aware of that. We have a very strong hierarchy around that. We have strong traditions around that. And the truth is, often in our child welfare world, some of these fights turn into who's got the most credentials and wrote the best letter, right? Do you see one of the values of what I did, which is we're not talking about healing ODD here. We're talking about healing unlivable lives. Now, who will we allow to heal unlivable lives in our culture? Give me some examples. How about, just because we're in this building, people called pastors? Do we let them heal unlivable lives? Right? Volunteers get involved in healing unlivable lives. family members get involved in healing them. Do you see the differences? One is an exclusive approach to viewing people that isolates them, and the other is an inclusive approach that says there are lots of examples that we can think of, extraordinary stories that we've learned in our lives of people who've done remarkable things that produced healing results for people who were living unlivable lives. They write books about them, you watch TV about them all the time. I would even argue homicide detectives heal unlivable lives for the living by solving crimes, right? There's a lot of room to heal when we're talking about an accurate assessment of what's really going on. Here's a question I have for you, and then I'm going to show you a challenging example as we move into the practicalities of this. Are there people that can, from a mental health standpoint or behavioral health standpoint, are there people that simply cannot be healed? What do you think? Are there people that are just too unwell to ever be well again? What do you think? And if there were, what kind of names would we have for this? Or if you don't believe that, does the community believe you? What do they think? What are the names of things the community at large would say, you people are crazy, that person needs to be locked up?
Psychopaths.
What's that? Sociopaths, exactly. What else? What do you mean by criminals? Lots of different criminals. Murder. Serial killers.
Even those with mental health issues like schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, yeah.
My ex-husband,
Who has what?
narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah. Right. I have some great books for you to read, by the way, so let me know. I have a number of colleagues who happen to be therapists who have those ex-husbands, and they have wonderful reading lists. One's called, and I do not endorse this literally, I'm just telling you what the title of the book is, How to Kill a Narcissist. It's one of them. Recommended strongly by one of my therapist colleagues. Yeah, look it up. You'll find it, no problem. How to Kill a Narcissist. Look it up. One of my favorite former colleagues, who's a therapist and has been talking about that. So I want to show you a film, and I apologize. What I think I'm going to do is we're going to show a film. It's a little longer than I would like, but I really want to show this to you. It is an extraordinary true story of someone who has many of the things you just said and what happens to him. And I think it really is an interesting and opportunity to expand our creativity when it comes to constructing or as facilitators, catalysts, and conveners in catalyzing healing for people that you wouldn't expect would be able to make a full recovery. What do you want to say?
Well, I have a question about the engagement process.
Yeah.
I have a case where the family has 5 kids, only one is in care.
Yeah.
And the team that works with her is fantastic.
Yeah.
She recently had some further trauma. She's constantly in and out of the hospital, things like that. And the team is incredibly supportive.
Is that the mother you're talking about or the young person?
The person.
Okay. Is it an adult or child?
She's 16.
16-year-old, okay. Yeah.
And so she's been in and out of the hospital and everything else, but the family, we have 4 of the kids that are successfully at home, all this other stuff, and the family is not willing to come to the table. I can't even get them to engage in education about her mental health diagnosis, which is borderline and bipolar, so things like that. And so
There's another one of those incurable diseases, borderline. Yeah.
these natural supports that are saying she just doesn't want to live our life.
Okay.
But the team is like, let's help this child. This child is full of potential.
Do you know these parents? Have you met them at all?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Let's do this. Take a minute. Just for fun. There's lots of ways you could do this with people, but let's just talk in words. Normally, I like to draw. First of all, drawing, there's a reason for that. And that is, I don't know, if you ever worked with a young person or parent who's extremely skilled at arguing. Have you met that person yet? who might be so good that one might say they have ninja skills for this. Have you met that one yet? And so why drawing with someone like that? You know why? Because think about what that means about brain architecture. What we use our brains to do, we build strong architecture for. Someone who develops that ninja ability to use their words to create space in their lives is someone who has an architecture that is probably far beyond anything you've got, right? That same person may not hold architecture for how to draw lines on a page and tell you a story, because you just took them out of the part of the brain that they use all the time and you put them into the part of the brain they almost never use. What did you just do? You just slowed them down so you can keep up with them. So one thing I would just at a high level just point out, be thinking more flexibly about what people's gifts are, their gifts are, and what you're really talking about is whatever their great gifts are, they've got great capacity for that thing. And they may have capacity you don't have. There may be no way to argue that person ever into a position of agreement. An agreement may not even be the point. It's really more about insight. So let's imagine that we were doing this drawing and you're sitting with the parents, so you can just kind of make up what they would do. But if you're the parent and I would ask you, first of all, I'm not going to argue with you about what you said. I mean, in a little bit, I'm going to teach you a really fun skill for that it's going to be your superpower that you get from me this week. So get ready. I'm going to teach you a superpower pretty soon. But you're the parent or parents, and you've got the story you just told me about. And what I'm asking you to do is, could you just from where you're positioned in this, as parents, could you draw a picture for me of your daughter's life? What would you draw? What captures the life this bipolar, what did you call her? They call her...
Her diagnosis is borderline personality disorder and bipolar depression.
Yeah, good. So the two awesome ones. This is great. I thank God they found a therapist to make their point for them. And thank God for you, because you guys are now the parents of last resort. Because that's what you're here for, isn't it? That's what you're here for, and they'll be happy to visit on occasion. They've sent their kid to what 60 or 70 years ago would have been the asylum. You people have become the asylum. Welcome. We'll call you a scatter site asylum, because people won't let you in the backyard with the big building anymore. So draw the picture of this girl's life from the parents' perspective. I'm sure it'll completely support their entire theory.
I think that stepmom is who she refers to as mom. I think mom would draw probably her fine, because she doesn't really bait into the fact of trauma, and that trauma exists for her. And I think that the dad would draw, like he tells me that she deserves to be in shackles.
So he's going to draw his little girl chained. And what's his wife going to do?
Probably draw her completely fine, because she just doesn't bait into the idea.
So this will be a really cool drawing on one piece of paper. One of the spouses is going to draw a kid who's perfectly fine. And the parent, the biological parent of that kid, is going to draw the same kid right next to this person in chains.
Correct.
And the truth of the story, from their perspective, is she is both.
Yeah.
Right? And where are they in the drawing?
I would say that they're probably going to put themselves on the fine side, that they're going to put everything on her.
Okay, and where are the brothers and sisters in the drawing?
3 of them are fine. They just sent one off to Texas because he shot a gun in the house.
So you'll draw a picture of Texas, and now is he on a walkabout and he'll be coming back, or?
I don't really know, because he's the one that perpetrated on my client.
Boy, but look, do you see what's happening here? The drawing just gets better and better. By the way, there's somebody missing. Let me guess who that is. Oh, by the way, the birth mother. Where's she in the drawing?
She's in prison in Texas.
Oh, in Texas. Oh, that's where they put the prisoners in the family. They go to Texas. Real law and order state. Not that Missouri isn't. This picture's just gorgeous. Where are you in their drawing? Where would they put you and all your helper friends?
Grandma and parents have told me that my purpose in life is to
Oh, so what are you, some angel? What, are you going to be floating over her?
To fix them. That's what
Well, how would you draw yourself in the drawing, and where are you in the drawing relative to her and the family?
I'm very close with her. I would say she reaches for me closer than she does her family.
Great. That was one thing I wanted to clarify. Are the parents really standing right there with her? No,
They think they are. Their excuse,
they would draw themselves there.
they have 4 other kids that they have to put as a priority because she has people to care for her.
Gotcha.
So their once every 5 to 6 weeks visits should be sufficient.
Okay. And anyone important where's Grandma in the drawing?
Grandma is very, very involved, super supportive, but grandma's in Texas too, but not in jail.
She lives in Texas.
Just lives in Texas.
Yeah.
She's not in jail.
Is that one that got sent with her?
I don't have full details yet.
Because it's not your kid and you don't have to know.
Well, I should know what's going on, you know.
I'm thinking from their perspective, like, hey, that's our kid. You know, we got it.
He's just in Texas and he's also 18.
Oh,
So
it's just a rough emancipation path for him.
kind of gave him a boot down there.
Yeah. And again, there's family there, so there's probably a rationale for why there. What's the question that the family has been at all these years that leaves this image?
The question that they say to me is that they don't understand why she's traumatized. They don't
Okay.
understand what's wrong with her.
Is that their question? Why is she traumatized?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, write it down. Now, what would happen if I asked the parents, having gone through drawing all this, can you picture the emotional state? Do you see what we're doing? What we're going to kind of just get a little bit past the rationales and get into kind of mapping with them how they see it. By the way, they may have never even seen it this way before. It may be the first time they've really had to sit down and kind of think about and agree and work towards agreeing as parents, agreeing where they're putting everybody. By the way, they don't mind putting mom in a little box with bars over there. That kind of probably feels pretty good. You know, that kind of stuff will be fine. But it's going to be a picture they've really never held in their minds before. And then they're going to be at this question, which is, what the hell happened to her? You know, and here's a question, though, I think it's important for parents to confront. What's the trajectory? What would they say her life will be like from this picture in 10 years? I'll be 26.
Last week her dad told me that she'll probably be in prison like her egg donor.
Right? Okay, that's where we're at. The question, how is my daughter traumatized, or how'd that happen, and where all these people are sitting, and this right, I didn't ask them something I didn't think they were already thinking about, right? But what I want to do is I want to leave it there. Just see here's the point. What I don't want to do is try to argue with them that their worldview and their decisions about all this are somehow wrong and that we're right and there's something broken about you. Because the truth is that we will never agree about that, will we? It's not going to happen. We talk sometimes about resolution. Have you heard that word? I think in really deep conflict, I think you rarely really do see resolution. If resolution means that somebody gets the other people to see it their way, that almost never happens, right? So instead, I think what we want to do is get a clean sheet of paper in front of them and challenge them to be a little more creative, given all of this. If your life was really working, if her life were really working, if she avoided this terrible future of repeating her birth mom's life, what would that look like? What's that drawing look like? The family's doing well. She's beat all the odds. What does life look like in that drawing? What would they say? Make it up.
I think that they would say that she would be back home.
Okay, so they're going to draw their little house, and they're drawing everybody in it. And what else? Where are you in the drawing?
I like to think I would be out of it, but I don't think that they can envision that.
So they would want you in the drawing.
I think so.
So part of a good life is you. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And here's the piece that we begin moving towards a transition in the conversation around is, if the question that you and everyone has been at is, what happened to her? Or sometimes we say the question this way, what's wrong with you, kid? And that's left us in this terrible image. And we could imagine that if life were really going well, we'd be together and we'd be home and you'd still be in our lives. And effectively what they're saying is somehow you're going to be a member of this family. Because in that world, how could they ever forget what you did? Right? There's nothing wrong with that relationship with the family. That's what we hope for. But what's the better or wiser question that got them to that from this? What do you think? What does she need? Or what do we need?
Well, both. I mean, depending on where you're.
But look at what just happened, because where we started the conversation, it's always been about her. She's broken. There's something wrong. You know exactly what's going on here. They, as a married couple, have not gotten over the thing that's at the heart of their marriage is his former relationship. And they can't talk about it. And it is lived through this little girl. But we can't say that to them. That's too hard. And it doesn't have to be said, because it really isn't about saying it. It's about living a good life. The working backwards would be from here to here. How much time do you think it would take? We haven't even decided what the solution is, but give me a working time frame. When would you want this life? When would you want that? Remember, where I'm heading to is what I said yesterday. Are you tired of living this way? Not, are you tired of how she's living? How are you tired of living this way? You've now got 2 kids out of your family, both with uncertain futures. How is that feeling? What are you worried about? Do you want to keep living this way? Our kids all leave one way or another, and then we live with how they left and what our relationship was with them for the rest of our lives. Right? Here's the point. The intervention's not in the little girl, and it never was. The intervention is in these 2 people. They're the parents. They're the adults. It is their family. It is their work, and they deserve support to do the work they want to do. But we started our conversation with the word engagement. And all that exercise is an attempt to transform engagement. Here's another way, quickly. Write a big unmet need statement for mom and dad. For mom and dad as parents to these kids, their single greatest human unmet need, what one word comes to your mind that comes closest to answering that question? Anybody, you're all experts on this kid now. Single greatest human unmet need as parents in this family, what word comes to your mind? Need means they don't have it. Remember, a need is what we don't have. What is it they don't have that if they had this thing, they could really have a chance to get to this different life? What do you think it is?
I would say transparency.
Tell me what that means. Use family language.
The kids don't open up to them. The kids don't tell them anything that's going on. And so there's always kind of like a low roar in the house of things, but there's safety.
If they had this thing, that wouldn't be happening. What's the thing that's missing? What's that? Those are fancy therapy words, nice social work language. How would your grandma say it? What do you mean by security?
Like connection, like they believe in each other.
Now we're getting someplace. Remember what I said? Get back to the marriage. Get back to what is playing out in their relationship. Because I think what they're afraid of is they're afraid that if they both had to really put on the table in a difficult way what is really going on between them and has been playing out through their children, they're not sure they could survive it. That's what you mean by security. I'm going to finish up and then give you a break, and then we're going to watch a movie. Back to Bill's point. I don't know if he stepped out. Was it Bill, right, that was talking about there? Yeah. I like, and I've always done this in my research, is I don't try to create solutions. I look for an analog. In Judaism, rabbis teach this thing for 4,000 years, and that is that when you face a problem in your life, you need to remember that there are wise people around you, and there have been wise people before you who have most likely figured out a solution to that problem. Right? So I tend to take that pretty seriously. I don't think of myself as somebody that creates solutions. What I try to do is look for examples of wisdom from other people. And I found that to be really helpful. And so to Bill's point, coming back to Kenny, even if we pull off a miracle and extract this kid briefly from the jaws of this system and drop him in the family, to Bill's point, you've just gone out of the frying pan into the fire, possibly. There's still so much work to be done there. How do we not, and this was actually Bill's comment was a follow-up to something he spoke to me about last night, which was exactly the same point. Well, yeah, we can get there, and I believe you, but what happens when we get those kids in these families and they decide they just can't do it anymore? This kid, we just can't do it anymore. And so I look for, of course I run into this all the time. And I like to look for analogs. So the analog that I decided to study, this was about 8 or 10 years ago, I thought to myself, well, where in the world can I find a group of kids that parents would not want home? Well, it actually doesn't turn out to be that hard. But I wanted to find a really super example of this. And you know what I landed on was child soldiers. So you guys are familiar with millions of kids around the world, and who, even in this hemisphere, by the way, who are basically taken from their families and are forced into combatant roles, or, by the way, for girls, often forced into non-combatant roles. So that it's not just an experience for boys. And one experience may be carrying out atrocities on the battlefield, but another experience may be the trauma of being exploited by the adults in these groups. And I don't know how much you know about this, but there's a standard kind of pattern to the way that people have learned to do this and be effective at it. And that is, they don't tend to take older kids, because older kids by this point, are not so dependent, and they can just run away and you won't be able to get them. So they like to get little kids. They like to get 6, 8, 10-year-olds. And so they come into a community, they have weapons and they're not afraid to use them, and they just round up the kids they want, and then they just march them out of the community. And anybody that tries to interfere with them, they just kill them. And they get these kids and they take them away for about a month to some location that they're going to prepare them, and they begin to systematically torture these kids, and they tend to feed them addictive substances to help numb them. So they are going to give them something cheap that's going to be create a dependency, and they're going to get these kids terrorized and using drugs. They're going to force them on them. They're going to do all kinds of things to them. But then there's one last thing they're going to do to them to make sure that they don't run away. And by the way, they're going to teach them how to use weapons. They're going to teach them how to operate an AK-47 or whatever weapon system they're big enough to hold. But then before they put them into action, they're going to bring them back to the village where they took them from. And they're going to have each of these kids commit an atrocity on someone in the village in front of everyone. They're going to have them murder someone, or do something, or amputate, dramatically amputate something. They're going to do something that's going to convince that kid that you have no home to come back to because you won't be welcome here. And that'll just be the beginning. That's just basic training. Now they're ready to go more deeply into it. And some of these kids would get captured or get lost on the battlefield and find their way home sooner than others. Some might be gone for years. Some end up being mothers of the children of the people who were captives too. And so what we see in the world around this experience is sooner or later, if you don't get killed, you're going to, the government's going to recover you somehow, or you're just going to simply walk off the battlefield, and sooner or later you're going to try to come home. But no one forgot what you did, and everyone knows what happens to these kids and how dangerous they are. So there are lots of stories about kids coming off the battlefield ultimately and finding their way home, and where the family makes the mistake of letting them come home. It's not been uncommon for the other people in the village to just burn the whole family's home down and drive them all out because they don't want to have that person in their community. So there's been lots of work done on what's called social reintegration of child soldiers over decades. And it comes down to one thing that the science says predicts whether or not you can successfully socially reintegrate a child back into their family and their community. Does anybody want to guess what that single thing is? What is the most predictive thing that you will successfully socially reintegrate that kid? What would you guess? And it's actually exactly what Bill said to me last night. And it is this: it is the degree to which the family and the community will make an unconditional commitment to that child's success. Simply that. And so when I say, what is the intervention anyway with the family that you're talking about? The intervention is not in the little girl, the intervention is in the parents, and whether you will be successful or not will depend on the degree to which the parents find a way to make an unconditional commitment to their children and to one another. And that is the intervention, period. There's nowhere to go but there first. And that might take some time, but that is the conversation. There's a great book that was a bestseller forever that you can read called A Long Way Gone, which is written by a former child soldier and his process of recovery. A Long Way Gone. What do we mean in that context about unconditional acceptance? There's a wonderful story in the book A Long Way Gone of the limits of unconditional commitment to the recovery of child soldiers. It's a story he tells after escaping the battlefield. By the time he gets back to where he had formerly lived with his aunt and uncle, they're no longer in the community. This was Sierra Leone, I think, maybe Liberia, I can't remember which one. And he has nowhere to go, and he ends up somehow, it's been years since I read the book, but he encountered an aid agency that was one of the agencies that's doing research on social reintegration of child soldiers, and they were operating a reintegration program for child soldiers, and he somehow runs into these people, and he joins their program, which starts with living with other child soldiers in the care of these professionals because they have no homes to go to. And the story he tells is one day a fight broke out between two of the kids in the building where they were housed, and it turns out one of these boys had not given them all of his weapons when he was taken into the program. He held back a grenade, and he had hidden it in his belongings and on his person. And when he got in the fight and started to lose the fight, he pulled the grenade out, he removed the pin, and he threw it on the floor in front of the other kids and staff. And the grenade did what it's supposed to do, and it killed two of them, and it maimed several of them. And my question for you, if you want to guess, is what do you think the program staff did to the kid who pulled the pin on the grenade? What'd they do to him?
Put in notice.
Huh?
They put in notice.
They got everyone the care they needed, and they kept moving. Unconditional means even if you pull a grenade and you throw it on the floor and you kill people, if you're going to make it a long way home, you're going to have people around you who love you enough to do that. It's interesting we're in this building because everything you would read in the book that this building's built around would argue that point. I mean, how many different ways could you get to the same answer? It's the only answer. And my point in telling you that story in part is I really admire the staff who do the work of social reintegration. Imagine being the staff who survived that and having the maturity and the courage and the understanding in that context that it is the only possibility, right? But imagine having someone like them sitting next to you if you were a parent with a kid that you don't believe could ever be okay. It may be that may be the most important role that you can play. Sometimes we would say about social workers, what a social worker does is they hold hope for people when they cannot. You hold the hope that these parents can be exactly what God made them to be because they can't. And it's the only chance. Otherwise, this kid probably has a more likely, just like the stepmom and dad have predicted, to repeat her own mom's story, which, by the way, was no accident. There was something that happened in this family a long time ago, and it never got fixed. And the fractures it made have only grown bigger over time, and they will continue to grow big, and the suffering will grow larger, and that will be their future, and we can predict that from where we sit today. Are you tired of living this way? You know, and people can become the writers of a new ending to their story, but they need someone to stand with them who believes in them. Does that make sense? So when are you going to go see them?
If I can get the dad back in the state of Missouri.
What's he doing?
Working,
What's he do?
something with bathtubs in North Carolina. I don't know why he's there for bathtubs.
Yes, you do.
I really,
You know exactly why he's there. Why is he there? No, he's not. That's not why he's there. Why is he there? He's escaping it. And the only honorable thing a man can do who can't face what's going on in his own marriage is at least to send a check home. Isn't it? And you missed that part in the drawing, which I would ask him to draw. Draw yourself in your little route back to your bathtub job. I'm not making fun of good, honest work, but I'm saying he made a choice for a reason. There's a reason he's doing that. And it just gets to the suffering that's going on in these people. And there will be consequences for this. What happens to their marriage, do you think? The kids are gone.
I think it'll crumble.
Well, they know that. It's terrifying. It's heartbreaking. Everybody's suffering.
And it's not going to be just the one girl.
Oh, no.
It's
No.
going to be the next one, the next one.
Yeah, it'll play out in different ways, right? Everyone's going to have to live with it in the best way they can live with it. And some people will live with it in ways that don't transmit their pain to too many people. And some people will find themselves transmitting that pain in every relationship in their lives for the rest of their days, right? So and by the way, I have no problem, if the choice of the family is to play this out, ultimately, it is their choice and is their lives to live. But if they've asked me to sit with them, I have to know what I stand for before I can know what I can do, right? And I don't want this suffering. I don't know what the solution is. What I know is there's great suffering. And I need to be honest about that. Here's me being honest about it. It might be as simply as this consistently. I am so worried. Every time I think about you guys, I find myself so worried. And at some point, somebody's going to ask me, why are you so worried? and then we'll talk about it. But I am so worried. Family seeing, not family finding. See the people standing right in front of you. Stop looking for people you like better. There is great suffering in this world, and there is great healing in this world. And the work of helping people find healing in their lives is a work worth doing. It's worth dedicating your life to, isn't it? But we haven't been doing that. We've been instead asked too often to play the role of making this system just turn along like it always had and not be too disruptive. Right? So let's take a break, and I want to show you an incredible film. You won't believe it. So when you do come back in 15 minutes, be ready to sit for 20 minutes and watch this movie, okay? Thank you.